say it's an honor for me to be here. They've asked me to speak on humility, so I can't say I'm proud to be here. But I want to stick to the time, so I'm going to speak from the notes that I've got. And I just wanted to say, one of my favorite books, which I couldn't find, I looked for it on my bookshelf, is called by Jeff Bridges. And it's The Practice of Godliness. That's the name of the book. And it's got to do with different attributes. Some of those you can regard as God-like. So love is God-like. But when it comes to humility, I've never heard somebody say, that's an attribute of God. So that's a God-honoring. So you get God-like and you get God-honoring. And both sets of attributes are important. But let me start with a few things about leadership before I get into speaking about servant leadership. First thing I want to say is that you will agree with me that we live in a world and in a country with a future that is unstable, that's unknown, and therefore potentially dangerous. And in global terminology, everybody is speaking these days about a VUCA world. Have you heard that? So it is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And if I want to add another one for this country, it's nasty. There's a lot of nastiness here that we have to address. Now, under these circumstances, I'm not speaking about servant leadership. Under these circumstances, people are looking at leaders. And they want leaders to find ways to make them more confident to face the future into which they are being hurtled. And in business in particular, the role of a business leader is within the organization, is to influence the organization, to follow the leader's vision. But equally important, influencing the organization to face its problems and to live into its opportunities. That's a challenge. So the leader of the future in this country, as it is around the world, will not only need to know how to mobilize people, but mobilizing them to tackle tough problems. So we know, leaders in particular, that we're not just in the world to adapt to the world as it stands like the tree outside there. That tree will adapt to the world. Leaders don't do that. You understand your world and you change your world. That's what makes you a leader. And it's a great thing. And somebody said, there are lots of things that's worth the pain, but being a leader is one of them. Now, what I've just said, you can read in any book. There's hundreds of books, if not thousands, on leadership. And what I've said is not new. And it's expressed in one form or the other. And the basic story about leadership is how to be a great leader. And that means, if you read the books, it will say how to get people to follow and listen to you, and how to achieve influence and how to make a difference. everything I've just said. You would even find titles about how to make your name known and build your company or acquire positions of power. So leadership isn't a new concept. It comes with the creation of the world. But when Jesus came, he decided to flip the narrative of leadership. And he flipped it on its head. And people didn't expect that at all. And it's not the kind of approach that you would want to use as a marketing strategy. But this is what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 25. I'm reading from the NLT. Jesus said, he called his disciples together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authorities over those under them. But among you, it will be different. Whoever, he says, whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If business people heard that for the first time, it will go down like a lead balloon. It's not the language that you find in the books that I've just referred to. For the first time in the verses that I've read, you find this beautiful concept of a servant leader. So, for Jesus, the goal of leadership is not to grab power, but to serve. Okay? So, in summary, I'm only going to give a broad summary of servant leadership now. I'll come back in a few minutes to go a bit deeper. But for now, servant leadership isn't about making our names known. It's about making God's name known and having the ability to love and respect the people who are left in our care. Using the authority we've been given with grace. So, there are two basic kinds of leadership. I don't want to deal with all the hundreds in the books. There are two kinds of leadership. One is called leadership of domination. And if you go with Machiavelli said, if you have to make a choice, to be feared is much safer than to be loved. That's the Machiavellian approach. The leadership of domination works. You get results. But then on the other side, there's a leadership of servanthood. It's what we need to understand. Once you understand that, you need to make a choice. Do I want to do that? So, in researching 1,500 companies, you know, in the book Good to Great, the author Jim Collins discovered that humility is the X factor of great leadership. If you want to choose an X factor, that's it. Look at Jack, whoever he mentioned. For a level 5 leader, it's humility. Now, so for a servant leader, and I'm still talking at that level, put broadly, servant leader has humility, but also has courage and insights to admit that they can benefit from the expertise of others who have less power than them. I work a lot with some of the foundations, in particular the Dell Foundation, the Dell computers. And Michael Dell said, make it your life's aspiration never to be the smartest person in the room. And if you find yourself in a room where you're the smartest person, go and bring somebody else in that's smarter than you. And if that still doesn't work, go and find another room. But you have to seek the ideas and unique contributions of others, your employees. They believe that none of us, and I believe that none of us are as smart as all of us. None of us are as smart as all of us. So, servant leaders in an organization will create a culture of learning and an atmosphere that encourages not fear, but followers to become the very best they can be. And I'll come to an example in a minute. You may be aware of that. But humility and leadership does not imply, neither of them imply, that leaders have low self-esteem or take an attitude of groveling civility. Instead, servant leaders emphasizes that the responsibility of a leader is to increase the ownership, autonomy, and responsibility of the followers. So, somebody said it here earlier, if you take, I think it was Voter, the word servant and the word leader are usually thought of as being opposites. And when two opposites are brought together, then you have a paradox. And so Jim Collins speaks about the paradoxical idea of servant leadership. Now, I just want the one for me personally, a takeaway in understanding Jesus' leadership. It's not a particular style of leadership. People say, now, what's the formula? It's not. Really, it's got to do, and I'll come back to that in a minute, it relates to the motivation behind your thoughts, your motivation behind your words and your actions. That's really what, it's not a style of leadership. So, you can still be a leader, a servant leader, even if you have vastly different leadership styles. And I must say, some people are extrovert, and they are boisterous and loudmouthed, but they could still be a servant leader. On the other hand, you can have somebody that's quiet and sedate, and in short, a wimp, and it can be a terrible non-servant leader. It's not to do with temperament. It's got to do with the motivation in your heart. That makes you a servant leader. So there must be a genuine desire in your heart, and I'll come back to that in a minute, to put emphasis on the needs of others, and people have said that. Now, an example. Firstly, let me just say, this notion of servant leadership is not just a Christian attribute. It's adopted as a guiding philosophy in many organizations. And one case that I've become aware of is the chicken franchise, Popeyes. You know Popeyes? I see there's one in Sandton now, one in Cape Town. In America, Popeyes is second only to KFC. It's the biggest rival of KFC. And if you just read it up, the full name is Popeyes Louisiana Kitchen. I see people don't like it here in South Africa. It's very popular in America. But a few years ago, about a decade ago, they were in big trouble. And their stock had sunk from where it was, $34, to a low of $13. And then they got a new CEO, Cheryl Batchelder. She started Domino's Pizza. She also worked for KFC. She got fired. KFC fired her. She was the president of KFC. But she joined in 2007. She joined Popeyes. And they needed help. And I've just read this article in the Business Leader where she was interviewed and said, what did you do? She's also written a book now. It's called Dare to Serve. And she explains in both the interview and in the book that becoming a servant leader helped her turn around that struggling company, Popeyes. And she describes how it grew from where she took over at the all-time low. And right now, by the time she left in 2017, the stock was trading at about $60. And the cap of $1.4 billion. But she had a humbling experience, I've mentioned that. And good leaders, to become a servant leader, it seems like you need that humbling experience. And her humbling experience was leading. In fact, she was the president of KFC for a few years, and he got fired for underperformance. She wasn't achieving the results. And then she began to question herself. And she asked herself, you know what type of leader do I want to be? She then met, now I'm just abbreviating that, she then met Jim Collins. And Jim Collins told her about this paradoxical mix of personal humility and professional will. And she says, I want to be that leader. It wasn't motivated by Christian beliefs. It was an aspiration that grew out of a realization that this makes sense. And she says that the biggest misconception, and I like this, about servant leadership is that most people discount servant leadership as a nice guy leadership. Yeah. So it's about hugs and campfires. Very few people have considered it might be the most effective form of leadership. And she says, look at Popeyes. It's a case study. And she makes one or two more points, and that is, she says the hardest part is the tension between being daring and being humble. The hardest part is that we all trained as leaders to win and to be exceptionally competitive. That's how we trained. We're hardwired like that. Doesn't matter what your field is. And there's nothing wrong with that. Except when it runs roughshod over other people. And the biggest distinction for me and for her of a servant leader from other leaders is one that serves others versus themselves. In the ability you listen. And when you listen, you hear people's anxieties, you hear people's fears, and you hear their objections. And you hear their solutions. And you give dignity in that process. You give dignity to other human beings. You affirm them. And people always will perform better under those circumstances. See, when she was at other places like Domino's and KFC, she had a mantra. And that was, and I quote her, think like a man, act like a lady, and work like a dog. And in the end, she got fired. It didn't work. And now being a servant leader means, she says, going to do this regardless of what recognition I get, because I believe in it. So I'm just going to talk about 4 qualities of a servant leader, and then I'm going to stop. So, servant leadership, I like to call it humility-based leadership. And humility is a non-overestimation of one's merits and not overvaluing oneself, but it's also a non-underestimation of oneself. It is not to be equated with poor self-esteem, but rather the ability to see one's accomplishments and talents in perspective. You don't have an overestimation of yourself. Now, a servant leader will always respect the worth of other people. I can quickly pick it up. People get discounted on the basis that they're in a different gender, a different race, a different socioeconomic background, and we ascribe in our minds value to that. In our minds, we dismiss that. And if that's the way you do it, you're not a servant leader. Humility forms the underbelly of servant leadership. So it's through humility that the leader learns to take attention away from oneself and focus on others. That calls for humility. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, we read the following: since God chose you to be holy, the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy and kindness and humility, gentleness and patience. It's all over the Bible. I can read many verses like that. Now, I think as leaders there's one danger, and I speak to my own heart, is that, particularly if you're successful, it's easy to become addicted to the power and authority attached to being a leader. You become addicted to it. One of the most difficult things to admit to ourselves and others is that we don't know it all. It's hard for a leader to do that. And if we're not careful, we can become what I call prideful and full of self-knowledge and full of self-assurance and have no time to entertain, particularly people that have a different view. Just dismiss it. But a servant leader is someone who has built-in space to learn and grow from the experiences and opinions of others. And I want to ask, have you ever had a chance to hear a story about someone else's culture, or step into a space where everyone looks different than you? Have you ever tried to sit down and have a meal? Diversity is always a resource for learning. Always. And I believe very strongly in diversity. When I came back from America, after being there 10 years, I went to Durban. I stayed there 15 years. And I lived in a very leafy suburb of Durban during those years. And then I decided with my wife that it's important for our children to be immersed in the authentic context of where we all grew up. And so I went back to Cape Town, where I'm living now, and I bought a house from my aging mother, where I grew up, and that's where I live. I woke up there this morning. And you probably read it in the papers all the time about Athlone and the Cape Flats. I live in the Cape Flats. But what hurts me probably most is on a Tuesday morning, the garbage comes along. And, you know, when I look down the street, I see all the garbage bins in front of each house. And at each of those bins, somebody's scratching to find a morsel just to eat. I can't, with good conscience, rationalize that away. I'm there for a purpose as a leader. And I've got to do what I can to change that. So, servant leaders can be seen as a leader. A servant leader is one that's concerned about the real issues in the world. I'll read you Greenleaf's definition to back up what I said. You know, Greenleaf was the person that started all of this. Of course, the copyright belongs to Jesus Christ, not to Greenleaf. But I have a definition of poverty. And in this country, you can't just talk about riches unless you deal with poverty. And for me, poverty is the inability to participate in society with dignity. And if I look down my street, I see all these people who cannot participate in society with dignity. And as a leader, as a servant leader, I have to do something about it. Greenleaf says the following. How much time? 5 minutes. Servant leadership, says Greenleaf, begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then, conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. The difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant. First, to make sure that other people's highest priority and their needs are being served. And the best test, he says, do those served grow as persons because of my leadership? That's the question. And he says, do they, while being served, become healthier? Do they become wiser? Do they become freer? more autonomous, more likely to themselves to become a servant in the future? And what effect on the least privileged in society, what effect does my actions have on the least privileged? Will they benefit, or at least will they not be further deprived? That's Bob Greenleaf. Two more things I want to say, and I've said it earlier, I want to say it again. That a servant leader has a heart, proper heart of a servant. That's where it sits. Not in your head, it's in your heart. Jesus, again, identifies himself as, he says in Matthew 11, verse 29, he says, you know the verse, come unto me all he that labor and are heavy laden. And he says at the end, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus led with his heart, not with his head. So humility is an attitude of the heart towards people. And a servant leader has a heart of love. And it's hard to serve people you do not love. You know, my wife and I, when she was alive, we started in Portugal and has now gone over to all Latin America. So you can Google it, you'll see that we've set up with others an Ubuntu Academy. And Ubuntu is a concept that was developed here. And yet, I don't see much Ubuntu. And I don't have time to talk about it. But I'm going with Barney Pajana next month, to one of those Ubuntu academies. But the heart of love is the result of being broken. You show me a leader that is not broken, and I'll show you a leader that doesn't have a heart of love. If you are broken at the right places, you develop a new heart, a heart of love. So finally, let me just say, what we need is empathy. That's the fourth thing. Not just a heart, but empathy. And empathy for a servant leader is simply being able to visualize yourself in someone else's position. It's easy to get hyper-focused on tasks and the work that we do. Work is important, and accomplishing goals is a tool. But if we're not careful, we can begin to see people as problems to be solved instead of human beings to be loved. And a servant leader will always see people through the eyes of Jesus. You know, there's a thing that I say, that I learned when I was in America, is that you change when three things come together. People just don't change automatically. You think about something, and then you feel it, and then you act. If you look at, I can give you other examples, but Jesus acted. He didn't only think about things, and didn't only feel about things. He acted. And so, as I sit down, servant leaders will not appear overnight. It's a decision. You make a decision. And you make a decision to become one. So you can say, I listen to you, but that's fine. I don't want to be one. That's fine. But it's a spiritual act. And then we have to realize it's God working in your heart. And he that began a good work in you will complete it until the end. And so if you say, God, I've made this decision. I really want to be a servant leader. I have no idea what it means. God will do the rest. I want to say in my personal life, almost every morning, when I get up, I'm guided by what's become a mantra for me. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. I remind myself, what does God expect of me? What does God require of me? 3 things. I don't talk about the 10 commandments, 3 things. He says, do justly, act justly. That's number 1. Number 2, love mercy. Not just being merciful. You must love it. It's your preferred option. Mercy. And thirdly, walk humbly with your God. And you know that every night when I think about, I say that every morning, and at night I think about it, and I realize how far short I come from being and doing what God requires of me. But I don't give up. I don't give up because we live in a low commitment world. You know, people are not committed to anything. And the last verse I want to read is in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Stickability. Looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. And we call that resilience. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for listening. There are many other things I can say, but maybe you have questions. So, God bless you.